Could be better. Apologise for that, I should have realised. So welcome to this meeting of the Regulatory Committee, and I would ask for any apologies. I know Councillor McCallum called me last night, said he won't be able to be here today. Is there any other apologies?
I'm happy to move that.
Thank you. Seconded by... Thank you. Sorry?
Councillor S.
Oh, Councillor S. All right. So there's apologies from Councillor McCallum and Councillor Esler. All those in favour of accepting those, please say aye. Aye. Anyone against? That's done, thank you. Declarations of interest other than ones you've already made that are particularly relating to this meeting. Right. Public forum petitions and deputations. I don't see any. I have not been notified of any. Extraordinary and urgent business and supplementary reports. None. Some questions. There will be some questions during the will pop up during the session. Is anybody's got any extra ones? No. Chairman and councillors' reports. Going through this. General Manager Integrated Catchment Management Report. Consent.
Yes.
Team activity.
Thank you. Through the chair, we've got Bruce and Donna here today to take through the results. Now, I need to start with an apology. I was remiss to not update the council formally that both Bruce and Donna have been permanently appointed into the position, so that was my oversight. Chair, so you may want to say a few words before we kick off.
Well, congratulations to both of you. Thank you. We're very pleased for you and for us.
Yes. It's been a long time in getting that settled, so I'm personally quite happy as well. So I think, Bruce, you're first up with the consent update.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Take the report as read. Just highlight
Mr. Chair, can I just ask, did we approve the minutes that, for the 12th of May?
No, we haven't, and I've circled it to come back to that. Alan, thank you.
Just take the report as read, just highlight a few matters, and I thought if you don't mind, if you can bear with me for 5 minutes or so, I might talk through that Ministry for the Environment update around the legislative reform, quite relevant to this committee, just highlight a few key points that was embedded in the report itself. Firstly, starting on page 10 of your agenda, just trying to put a bit of focus on emerging issues in these reports. First one I wanted to sort of flag for your attention and awareness was around some recent processes that we're dealing with farm-related activities. And an interesting recent trend has been some submissions highlighting concerns around groundwater quality, in particular groundwater nitrate issues. As I'm sure you're aware, that issue has been receiving a little bit of national media coverage as well. In a nutshell, people concerned about the linkages between rising groundwater nitrate levels around the country and what areas and the potential health impacts of that. So it has been interesting to see that coming through some of our submission processes, and we've also had some dialogue with some parties outside of consenting processes around this issue. It also has come up in a few local government official information meeting act requests. Just to sort of follow up on that somewhat, we've been looking across the science and compliance and consents teams about seeing if we can consolidate some of the material that we receive from our monitoring processes and consent holders reporting to us, as well as information we hold in-house, to try and have a bit more of a consolidated view that staff can access more easily for decision making. Moving on to page 11, you'll be aware that there's been some ongoing interest and quite close scrutiny around field consenting processes, and the plan change to the regional coastal plan has now been publicly notified. So as I've mentioned there in the end of that top paragraph, that is likely to increase the number of applications that become publicly notified. So you may see more applications of a fieldland area being publicly notified than has been occurred previously. As also mentioned, emerging issues. We've had some ongoing good constructive dialogue with territorial authority staff around upcoming consenting renewal requirements around wastewater systems in particular. And as has been mentioned there, that is a high bar now for reconsenting of those types of systems. So it's good to be having an ongoing dialogue. And the territorial authorities are looking at their existing systems and seeing how they can potentially upgrade those to meet the current legislative framework. Some of those systems are quite old and serve communities that are not huge, so it's quite a challenge for them, but we've had some good dialogue with those territorial authorities, so it's good to keep that going. So moving on to the legislative reform, obviously we've reported on this before, sort of quite timely just before I finished this report for the agenda, I got an update from the Ministry for the Environment about the direction of travel, so just bear with me a minute, I might just talk through some key changes there. You've probably read this, so I won't labour on it too much, but the July update was interesting, gave a little bit more clarity around timing and the thrust of some key initiatives. And particularly the Spatial Planning Bill and the Natural and Built Environments Bills are due to be presented to the House or introduced to the House in either September or October this year, so that's getting pretty close now. And as you're aware, we've had opportunities to submit on some of those processes to date through the development stage. Another interesting point from the June budget was that the government has allocated $179 million over 4 years to reforming the resource management system. And another key thing that sort of flows from there is consolidating all the various national planning instruments that we operate under into a more coherent framework. There's currently 23 different national standards and national policy statements, etc., which is quite a challenge to A, get your head around, and B, make sure you cover fully on an individual proposal. So I think for the consents team and the compliance team, resource management team, it will be a positive thing to have some consolidation of those various instruments over time, because there's a lot of stuff to keep track of for reporting purposes. Another key item is consolidation of planning documents. There's over 100 regional and district planning documents around the country at the moment, and the long-term intention is to consolidate those into what would be approximately 14. So we have 7/8 that we deal with regularly in the consents team, and other councils have similar. Some councils have less than that, but there are quite a number of planning instruments that have been developed. So one of the key aspirations of this legislative reform is to try and consolidate those documents. And a big part of that is also providing for some more effective mechanisms for Māori to participate in those processes and sort of make sure that the intergenerational thinking from Tangata Whenua comes through in those planning documents. Another sort of key item really is the theory is that if you have better front loading through your planning documents, then you have less consenting requirements, and the intention being to try and streamline the consenting process over time. A part of that is that currently we have 6 different categories of activity under the Resource Management Act. We've got permitted activities that you can do as a right, controlled activities that must be granted, restricted discretionary that you can decline, but you have to put conditions on under the matters of restriction, discretionary activities which can be either granted or declined, non-complying activities, which is an extra high bar, and then prohibited activities that you can't grant at all. So the intention is to get rid of restricted, discretionary and non-complying activities, so they only become 4 categories of activity: permitted, controlled, discretionary and prohibited. So that'll be interesting to see that reform move through. And probably the other key thing I'd just highlight is that the government has put a bit of a timeline around how long they think it may take to transition from the current system to the new system. I said they're thinking of like a 7 to 10 year time frame, and that's a reasonable period of time. But if you think back to, I can for my sins remember the enactment of the Resource Management Act back in 1991, dating myself a bit here. But we've had a reform that we've had a current system that's got a 31 year now lifespan, so you don't transition out of that into a new system in 2 seconds, and particularly when you start consolidating planning documents, that is a big task. So that's probably the first time I've seen from MFE a bit of definition around what they see as a realistic time frame to transition from one to the other. That's going to be done in a series of tranches, so it's not all going to take that long necessarily, but it is a big process. And another key thing is probably using more technology. Plans of the future are likely to be more digitally based than the old hard copies that some of us got very used to lugging in different parts of the country, and that makes sense. Some plans already through different parts of the country are e-plans, so you can click on a particular site and get all the relevant material through that process. So that's just a quick overview, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully that's a bit of use in terms of the general direction of travel. There's a fair bit of water to pass under the bridge under that, yet obviously, but certainly government is continuing on with its plan of reform and with some reasonable haste as well. Just a couple of other things I'll just highlight in the report, page 12. Workforce is quite a challenge for all consents departments across the country, both at regional and district level. We've got some good development happening across the team, and when I'm finished I'll circulate this little graphic that tells you who's in the team and what they do. Might be some useful future reference. So I guess a key focus for us is making sure we have the people that we need to continue to do the work. And that's not just a numbers game, it's about people who understand what they are being asked to do, and that is an important element of it, making sure that people have the training they need and the knowledge they need to succeed and to make recommend good decisions and make good decisions. Flowing through to page 13, just to highlight a couple of things that have happened recently. We've had a number of hearings happening over the last few months. Because of COVID restrictions, a number of them have happened via Zoom. Really impressed with, not taking any credit for it, but various members of my team have really gone the extra mile to get those technologies working really well. And we've had pretty seamless hearings where they have had to happen through Zoom or Teams type technology. So it shows that it can happen. We're now starting to move back to more sort of physical hearings with the Teams option if people want to use it. But that's been really pleasing to see the process to be able to keep moving, albeit that people might have been doing it from different parts of the country. And the timeliness of processing has continued to be good. That's a credit to the team, even though they have been working from home for some of the past quarter. We're all back in the office now, so sort of back as BAU now. And sorry, a final thing I was also going to highlight, one of our senior consents officers, Jade McRae, who many of you will have met, is doing a secondment to Environment Canterbury on a part-time basis. So she works for us in the morning and ECAN in the afternoon, and she's assisting them with some of the high-end farming consents, which is sort of her technical specialty area. But there's also some really good learnings for her and professional development for her in interacting with a bigger organisation. ECAN consents team's about 58 people, I think, and they have 9 sitting at principal level, so they've got a lot of experienced staff. So we see that as hopefully a win for Jade, but a win for ECAN and Environment Southland in terms of developing the linkage and professional development. And noting that skills shortage thing I referred to earlier, I think it's really important that we try and enable those opportunities where we can and give people a strong development curve. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Bruce. You've covered quite an area of territory there. And thank you for the update on the legislation and the intent for that to be introduced and activated. Chairman Horrell.
Yes, no, thanks for that, Bruce. And just noting some of your comments on the reform of the RMA. Quite surprised at what they're going to drop out. I thought maybe control would have been one to drop out rather than what I thought was, because you've got to give it anyway. I would have thought maybe you would have kept restricted discretionary, but it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. But I guess the other thing is, if it's going to take 7 to 10 years, we're going to have almost a dual legislative process going on. It'll be the early movers that are using the new stuff and the others that are still on the old one, which I think will probably cause a bit of confusion going forward. But also great to hear that that was a secondment to ECAN. I think that's really good that we can work together, share resources and help upskill each other. That's really good to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think on the timing aspect, the Ministry has said there'll be various tranches of work. So I expect that some things will become operative faster than others. don't exactly have the detail on that at this point in time, but probably some of the plan reform stuff, it takes time, as we know. So I expect the 7 to 10 years won't be everything, but some of the plan reform to move from 100 plans to, say, 14 plans is a big exercise.
The 14 is quite interesting because at the moment there's 16 regional and unitary authorities, but you've got the small 3 unitaries have been told to put one to try and the common plan. So it sort of gives some hint of what's going to happen with local government going forward.
There are existing precedents for combined district planning documents. It's not an entirely unknown territory, but yeah, it's going to be easy to say, not so easy to do in terms of that process. It's a big exercise.
Councillor Baird's put his hand up too.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. We're just inquiring, looking at the list of the on page 13, where we've got the different consents coming through, notified or partly notified. Land use dairy farming, land use dairy farming, land use dairy farming, land use dairy farming. What is there a consistent sort of aspect to each of those requests? I mean, obviously, most of the industry knows you're going to struggle to be able to add more cows, and certainly unlikely to a new dairy farm is out of the question. But are we looking there at fine-tuning the land that maybe the dairy farmer's got as he bought another 50 hectares? And I think I've asked this sort of question before, but is there, should we have a revisit when we're looking at plan change to Otahi? We've got obviously an opportunity to look at our existing planning document, and without giving I guess too much opportunity for dairy industry to take over a lot of the land. But is there something that could be done to make the process a little more streamlined, other than having to come through a notified consent process to buy additional land on the boundary of a platform, and therefore be able to milk over a big area, but no more intensively?
Yeah, through Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. Most of the, as I've mentioned in the report, most of the applications that we're currently getting for farm-related or particularly dairy-related activities, most but not all are not actually increasing herd numbers or necessarily increasing the intensity of their farming. It's usually the trigger for needing additional consents has been increasing the platform size, so the people bringing in additional land into their dairy platform. And that doesn't always trigger limited or public notification. But we have got some parties that we're regularly identifying as stakeholders or affected parties in that process who have some quite firm views on those issues. And if they're identified as an affected party and they don't provide a written approval, then that will translate into a potentially limited notified or sometimes a publicly notified process. People are sort of pushing the envelope a little bit more in terms of intensification and completely new activities, then that is somewhat at odds with the direction of our planning documents, so it can then trigger a publicly notified application. As to whether we could potentially front load that process a little bit more through more plan clarity, there's probably some scope for that. Probably don't want to say sort of preempting of that because it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but certainly something we could probably have some further dialogue on. As Councillor Baird has said, we generally have pretty good constructive dialogue with the consultant sector, and most of the consultants are pretty good. If they think something's going to be a bit challenging to consent, they will make some preliminary contact, and hopefully we can talk that through with them. And we've had some positive dialogue in a number of applications where there's been some additional mitigations or some changes made to, for want of better wording, get to a more readily consentable regime.
Thank you, Bruce. Councillor Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a query actually from the public, Bruce, regards cost of winter grazing consents. It seems to have varied considerably, and I think the value that, well, I wouldn't say value, but the cost was something in the vicinity of 15,000. So I'm not sure whether that's consultants that are involved in that or not, but also the timeframe, whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, are we looking at the possibility of actually being several years consents for that, or are we looking at just 1 yearly?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. Good question. We've the consents that were processed to date have been basically multi-farm operations, except for one, which was a single farm. So one, for instance, Springstone Line, like the same one you're referring to, was a 5-farm consent, and it was granted for a 10-year timeframe. We are limited under some of the regulations. We can't grant beyond 2030. So, and another interesting aside to that is we've got a stream of dialogue going between ourselves, ORC and ECAN to try, as much as we can, have a level of consistency across the 3 lower South Island councils about our approach to intensive winter grazing, so that we don't have one council with the bar way up here and another one down here. So that's been quite good. We've got some templated documents that are sort of generally consistent that we'll be looking to use. The cost aspect, ORC, their processing deposit from memory is $1,750, and that's basically consistent with our processing deposit. Whether there's an additional charge over and above that, to some extent, depends on the complexity of the application and also how many triggers there are. Some activities, if the only provision that you're breaching is slope, for example, then some people can probably manage around that and say, well, actually, I won't intensively graze my sloping land. But a lot of people won't necessarily be able to do that just because of contour and that sort of thing. So that hopefully should be able to be set up as a reasonably straightforward process. If people are breaching 5 different things, then it could be a little bit more complex. So we're trying to set the process up. We've got an online form which has been working generally okay. Trying to make it reasonably simple for the customer, but also conscious that we're trying to make sure it achieves the objective, I guess, of improving practice. There's lots of good practice happening out there. I think that winter grazing fights have highlighted that, and generally the bar is being lifted across the sector, and that's credit to the sector. That's good to see people incorporating those good practice things. But where we finally land on overall cost probably depends on an application by application basis. But we're certainly trying to make the process as streamlined as we can without making it meaningless, to be honest with you, because there's some strong scrutiny around this issue. The Minister's been quite clear on his expectations around managing this in an appropriate way, so that encouraging good practice, discouraging damaging practice. So it's getting the sweet spot on that, I guess.
Good, thank you. Jerry McFarlane.
Carol, we've asked a couple of questions around the cost, but have we got an idea, I suppose, how many winter grazing consents do we need? Obviously, the sloping one's probably going to trigger a lot of the consents. Also, what discussions are we having that, obviously, in the RMA, if we have a certified freshwater plan, we can eliminate those things, but we're forcing people to have a consent, go through a consent process that maybe even next year, I don't know when the certified will override, will that technically override the consent? So I'm just trying to work out, is the MFE or the government in theory, are we having discussions around, is there a pathway to maybe involve industry plans people have now that could actually be an interim point? But at the end of the day, governments have said, if you get this, you don't have to do this. And at the moment, they're not providing that. We haven't got that set up. But we do have a lot of farm plans and industry levy group farm plans, which are actually probably working really well through good management practices. I was just saying, would there be any chance that, if we were allowed to, if people had those farm plans in place, that that could be an interim to not be stressing about the consents, because this is going to be a huge workload for us, and I think we'll get the ability to do it. And it's going to be a challenge. But also it's saying, well, that's an interim until we actually get the certified plans, because that's going to be the document you need to be able to farm. So I'm just trying to, is there discussions around that? Are we as a council doing that. I know maybe some of the levy groups are sort of pushing, asking the government questions on certified farm plans coming.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. There certainly is some dialogue as to whether, if we hold fire, will the certified farm plan create a alternative pathway altogether so you don't need to go through the consenting process? There's some dialogue on that happening between regional councils and at a national level. We don't have that clarity at the moment. I guess we're trying to gear up to be as ready as we can be for what the current regime is. So yeah, there's a possibility that there's no sort of bridging type, your current farm plan does it for this year type arrangement. So at the moment, the good answer, I guess, to your question is no. There's either you get a consent or you, maybe the certified farm plan thing will kick in time to sort of not require people to get a consent for May next year. But I think we've got a sort of plan around the fact that people, many people are likely to need a consent. In terms of how many, that is difficult to estimate. We've had estimates ranging between, say, 300 up to about 2,000. To some extent, that depends on how people choose to undertake their activity and where. But we're certainly gearing up for the possibility we could get several hundred type applications, depending on where things go and how quickly that certified farm plan system moves. So we don't want to have something that people are trying to muddy their way through 500 times. We'd sort of try and make it reasonably straightforward for them and also not break our team at this end as well.
Just another quick question in regards, is the government, after the report comes through in regards to reviewing their process on planning, which is causing, had caused a bit of grief in the years gone past regarding pugging and sloping rules, and certainly indicating the MFE were quite involved and were probably listening to the councils and the feedback. There was obviously a political ministerial decision a bit further up that made the decisions. Is there a bit more open, I suppose, a bit more openness from the governmental people wanting to work with the councils in regard after looking at those reviews? Has there been a change? Have you seen at a ground level?
To be honest with you, we don't have a lot, or I don't have a lot of direct dialogue with the Ministry for the Environment at an individual council level. The consents managers group at a national level has regular dialogue with the Ministry. In some respects, that's not a bad level to have it at, because then you can hopefully send some consolidated messaging and get a little bit more grunt, I guess, in terms of collective lobbying. If you've got 16 different regional councils all saying 16 different things, it gets a bit confusing for government. So mostly that dialogue happens at that level rather than individual council level. I mean, as you said, the combined submission, which I take zero credit for, but it got really good traction with government last time around. So they seem to be prepared to listen if it's presented in a coherent way. But at this point in time, we're pretty much boxing on with what we've got, planning around what we've got.
Thank you. Councillor Stephens, you had a supplementary question?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I've got another wee query. With the consents that are taking place at the moment, Bruce, obviously, I would imagine you're taking into consideration the possibility of that changing. I'm just looking at some of those consents, if they go out 10 years. We've got the limit setting process going to take place. Obviously, you're aware of that. I mean, and some of that information will change as we shift through, but it's probably a concern I have as to just within particular areas, particularly to do with winter grazing, just the effect it could have on those areas as far as limits go within those areas.
Through discussion, good question and comment. We do have some planning guidance in our planning documents around term of consents. I mean, consents generally right across the country for pretty much everything are getting shorter. So, it's becoming increasingly challenging to get, consents, 25, 35-year consents that might have been granted 10 or 15 years ago. For things like intensive wind grazing, I suspect that the general bar seems to be landing around the 5-year mark. So that's probably where we're likely to gravitate. Our planning basically refers to generally 5-year minimum terms. Other councils don't necessarily have that. But for some other activities, say for instance industrial consenting, the applicants want a level of certainty of operation moving forward. So it's sort of a horses type approach, but generally speaking, consent terms are significantly shorter than they used to be right across the country.
I suppose the concern I have is if something's put in place and then we move into a limit setting process within an area and we're locked into something.
Yeah,
we can't
absolutely.
exit out.
It could frustrate the ability to achieve the limits effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, with the changes or as they're being signalled, it's likely that a longer term consent's not going to be in everybody's interest. Councillor McCallum put an apology in for today, but he had, as a result of your commentary on page 10 about nitrates and health effects, he's asked the question about the reporting of nitrate applications. That may be more about compliance than consents. Just questioning that if there's a fee payable for lodging the data.
I can cover that, Mr. Chair, in my report.
And if I could step in onto Councillor McPhail's comments, I think Bruce's answer is the working answer. I know that those concerns around the transition from consenting to the farm plan has been raised to me as well. I think what we can do is continue to raise those concerns. So it's still an ongoing topic. We're boxing on with what we plan to do, but acknowledge that there are some concerns around that transition and the people's need to get a consent or wait for a farm plan. So I'll take it upon myself to raise that in that regional conversation, national conversation.
I think the community's looking for simplicity. They're going to do one thing this year, and then next year you'll go, oh, you can get a certified farm plan, but I've just spent $5,000 on this, I have to go and spend $5,000 on that. And we're going to look so like we've got to lead this discussion, and we just need to make sure because we don't have the personnel, we've got a good personnel, it's actually the volume of stuff that's coming, so we just can't effectively do it all.
So currently there's no interim solution, but we'll raise that as maybe a concern.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if there is an alternative solution that materialises between now and when the rubber starts to hit the road on this, then certainly that will be probably positive for everybody. But we also want to try and do what we can to deal with what we've currently got. And for example, we're going to probably talk a little bit more about nitrogen cat reporting, where the regime has kicked in before the national tool was ready. So we're probably trying to avoid follow potential carnage, for want of a better word, if we had nothing ready to go and we put all our eggs in the basket of some alternative solution being ready in time and it didn't happen.
Because we're in a time of uncertainty, aren't we? And constant change.
Would you like to circle back to
the
Well, we'll get the minutes out of the way. I think Councillor Baird would like to. There's confirmation of the minutes on May the 12th. I apologise for overlooking that when I leapt through the agenda. Thank you, Councillor McPhail. Seconded by Councillor Stephens. That was a motion to approve confirmation of those minutes. Is there any discussion on that motion? If not, put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Anyone against? Thank you, that's done. I had a question. There was an article on TV about peat mining. Do we hold any consents for peat mining, or is that Southern District?
It's usually a combination of both, actually. I can think of a couple of peat mines you're both familiar with. One, the Thompson's Crossing area, and there's another one down in Puka South. And they usually need a land use consent from Southern District Council and usually some form of drainage or discharge consent from Environment South.
The focus of the TV article was that that is being banned in many parts of the world now. It takes thousands of years to create those peatlands, and then we're mining them within a short space of time, and we actually have the capability to make our own peat from the results of the forestry, particularly the pine plantations, using the bark and the slash. I just thought I would mention that, I thought it was probably something relevant. If anybody else asks for more permits. Councillor Guyton would be interested in that one, yes, Councillor Guyton.
Yes, indeed I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, there's a couple of issues around that. One is that is the climate change greenhouse gas issue, literally the issue from that operation of drying up those peatlands and then mining them. The loss of carbon back into the atmosphere is phenomenal, and I can't really understand why we are not involved from that aspect, given that our responsibility has expanded considerably in the last couple of years in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The second thing is that I think when you're talking about peat, you might be thinking about potting mixes and so on for various gardening processes. Peat isn't made from forestry excess. Bark chip based potting mixes are quite different from a peat mix, so it's just a bit of a mix up with the words there. But I would be very interested to know why we are not applying ourselves to those peat bogs and their uses, given our new responsibility that we hold over greenhouse gas emissions in our region.
For you, Mr. Chairman, I'll do just to answer that. Those couple of existing consented operations that I talked about, without knowing exact dates, they've been in existence probably at least 20 years. We have no current applications for commercial peat mining in our system. Separate issue, probably one that Councillor Guyton's touching on, is there's whole lots of new provisions around wetlands. And quite often peat bogs would become wetlands under the NES and or our planning documents, and they do have a high level of protection now under national environmental standards. So if there was a new activity looking to extract or mine peat, then the bar would be much, much higher than it was when those existing operations were consented.
I think I just noted that I think your answer to my first question was that Southland District Council deal with the application for the actual mining. Environment Southland deals with the drainage issues surrounding those areas, is that correct?
I'm assuming that's usually the way. Sometimes they, depending on how they process the peat, there could be an air discharge element, but most of the time that is the case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No questions? No further input or questions?
No, just on that issue, Mr. Chairman, I think protecting existing wetlands is probably more important than the very small scale stuff that's left with the existing consents. I think it's in the whole picture of things, it's probably not large anymore. So.
Thank you, Chairman Hall. All right, do we have a motion to receive that report from the Consents Division?
Happy to move, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Seconded by Councillor McPhail. Any further discussion? If not, put the motion. Please, all in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against? It's carried. Thank you, Bruce, for your very complete report.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll just circulate the graphic of who's in the team and what they do if that's useful.
That's good. Thank you. Yes. And again, our congratulations on the permanent appointment.
Feel free to stay at the table, Bruce.
I'm just giving you the contract that you're stuck with.
So, Donna, the permanent manager of compliance, would you like to present your report, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will table the report and reason my say it's pleasure to actually be able to present this one in person rather than via Teams. So I'll just highlight a few updates since the writing of the report before opening up for questions. On page 19, I've commented on the winter grazing, and this was just before our second flight. Our second flight this season for July was around the weather event. We purposely try and do one flight around a weather event just to make sure that Plan Bs and Cs that landowners have put in place are functional and working, and to give us the opportunity to provide feedback or advice and education as needed. This year, the second flight had 3 follow-ups, 1 completed by desktop, and 2 were site visits completed this week with no further action. What we knew from this, the air was not active discharges but just fencing. Went out to confirm and everything was actually okay and no breaches located on site. On page 20, Under key challenges, I've commented on recruitment. At the time of writing, we had 7 vacancies within our team. 1 is now filled and someone's sitting in that seat, and 3 are in the final stages. These vacancies are due to career progression opportunities within the compliance department to rather make it a career rather than just a job, so we can retain staff and the knowledge in that area. And applications at this stage are looking really good for the other vacancies. Under team matters on page 21, I've noted that one of our team members has completed UAV or drone training. This will enable us to be able to use the drone as required for incident response, but I want to reconfirm to the committee and the community, landowners will be made aware if we're going to be flying drones, and at this stage it is only intended for incident response. Now I'll skip back to page 20 and cover synthetic nitrogen.
Thank you.
So synthetic nitrogen came into play on the 1st of July 2021 and first release data was due on the 31st of July this year. When we perceived a risk that there wasn't going to be a central portal developed in time to enable consent holders to be compliant with that date, we launched a pre-developed online form to enable them to supply us data until the central portal was ready. To date, we've received around 400 sets of data and we're expecting around 900 in total, so we've had a really good response. Following on from the announcement of the date change, we have still been receiving data via our own online form. However, we will be waiting and working with comms to ensure that when the online portal is launched, that is on our website, so the community have the opportunity to report via that way or our form, whichever they find most useful. Initially, there had been some invoices issued for the receipt and processing of the nitrogen data. It's part of our standard process for all data received to receive this fee. The fee is outlined in our fees and charges schedule as part of the Local Government Act. However, we have continued to process the data but stopped the invoicing in the interim while I review whether or not we continue to do invoicing. So I can make no assurances at this stage, but that is currently under consultation. Happy to open for...
That was the question that I had from Councillor McCallum, and it was suggested that charging a fee for that collection of that data was sort of contraindicative to getting compliance. But that was something to think about. The other was 400 lots of data have been submitted out of a possible, 900 did you say?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Is that within a relatively short period of time? Is that a good result in your mind?
Through you, Mr. Chair. It was around 6 weeks' time, so it was a really good response using our online form. We did receive a few via direct email, and that was mainly from organic sites just to let us know they don't apply nitrogen, and that was good feedback for the form for us for further developments.
Thank you for that. Jeremy?
Just in regards to the obviously the $90 fee, in regards to that, is that under the reports data and notification where the fee comes into, it's a compliance monitoring report, it's required as part of the consents conditions, but if it's not written in the consents condition, like there's something new, is there a law that says that you can add? You know, I'm just asking a question saying, oh, how can you, it's not in the conditions.
So through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct. Through the Local Government Act, we do have the authority to charge so long as it's in relation to a national environmental standard or part of the resource management.
But at this stage, you are stopping that.
Currently on pause while we consider.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Thank you. Chairman Horrell?
Yes, well, on this issue, this is just another example of regional councils being the meat and the sandwich for a government directive that hasn't, and they haven't lined up things properly with their portal. They promised, they've now actually put the date back, so hopefully it'll happen. But at the moment, people get Balance or Ravensdown to do it at no cost. So we're incurring costs, I understand that, but politically we're sort of caught in the middle, and it's an unfortunate situation. The sooner we get a standardised system that everybody can use, the better, really. So.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I
Councillor.
could just make one comment that we do understand this has been extremely frustrating for a lot of consent holders, duplication of data for an unknown purpose for some people. So we want to work with consent holders, and we've been providing a lot of advice and education on the phone with what we have and links to websites which we've found really useful for upskilling our staff. So we're really happy to continue to do that if landowners want to make contact with us.
Thank you. Councillor Beard.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So just a wee bit further on the 190 reporting, the 400 that have come in, has there been a degree of consistency in how they have been responded to the level where we're relatively happy with those 400 lodgements, or do you see that there may be a requirement for further feedback on some? Are we going to review them all over time and say, well, it looks like it's a wee bit sketchy, the information, or largely we appreciate that they've responded and it'll conclude at that point? And a further question, are we obliged to follow that information on to MFE, or was that largely this information going to stay within our entity now and we're following the directive from government?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we will be reviewing the data over the coming months. It's a lot of data to go through, so it will take a period of time to do that. And as we review and assess the data, consent holders will be advised of our findings and will provide feedback. Predominantly, they seem to be very consistent from a cursory glance of the data coming through. There's been a little bit of confusion around the national messaging of what their land holding is or how to categorise the hectares, so they're able to report that. So that's where our inconsistencies have come around understanding what they need to provide us and how. Regarding the data we hold, yes, we will be looking for a way to feed that back into the central portal if that option is available for us.
Councillor McPhail.
Just another question in regards to the flights. Have we got any way of showing, obviously some parts of our society that indicate that we're not doing anything, blind eyes, and to not really show a real picture, but personally I know there's a lot of change going on. That we can show them where we're flying, what areas we've seen, or indication, just a bit more information to the public community, and really reiterate. Obviously, I take it we are having a good look, and it's also being backed up by MPI, what they're seeing too. So it's just another way of trying to reiterate, maybe trying to drown out which ones that say we're not doing enough at all, is their fault.
So through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we do have the opportunity. At the moment, what we're doing is not having predetermined flight paths to enable us to identify and fly to an area that we perceive may be an issue, or following on from feedback or calls that are coming through our pollution line, or feedback from our catchment integration team. So, but we can get a GPX file from our helicopter pilot post-flight, and we could make that available.
It would be good to see where they've gone, and then they've had it.
Somebody will say, but you didn't go to that area over there, right?
At least then, it's one of those things.
You mentioned recruitment, Donna. What's the risk to the organisation of us not being able to fill those staff positions within a reasonable time?
There is a risk. There is a risk at the moment that not all consents are being monitored. However, we are prioritising by their risk analysis on the consents. We're upskilling a number of staff, so we have 2 new monitoring staff who are currently out doing some field training today. They've completed their sample training, and so they're just in the final stages of being warranted and being able to go out on their own. So, and a lot of the roles that are currently sitting vacant are desktop roles, which the remainder of the team can backfill and support in the interim.
It might be worth Donna just explaining the journey that the team's been on, because I think you've alluded to it. Some of the vacancies are additional roles that have been created and some internal movements. But it might be helpful for the committee just to understand that the administration role leading through to the officer role leading through to seniors, leading through to some of the technical leads, because that's, you've actually developed quite a comprehensive team, and we're only moments away from being fully complemented, hopefully. So maybe it might just be helpful if you have a little bit more detail on the team.
My apologies, this is my normal, so sometimes I assume everyone knows what's happening inside. So historically, we've had a very flat structure where there was staff, team leaders, and then a manager. What we've done is try to redevelop that so there's career progression in the team. At the moment, we have added some senior roles, sit below a team leader to help with the hands-on field training or desk-based training, and they're technical experts in their area, be it field monitoring for dairy or truck wash and landfill, or industry-based for more of our industry consents for meat workers, etc. So we've developed those two roles. We've also put in a tech lead, which is a principal role, so they will oversee and provide a lot of expertise and training to incoming staff and be a well of knowledge for all of our team, all the organisation around compliance and RMA. We're also looking at it and putting in 2 new desktop assessment roles, so that would be an integration from an admin person into being an officer, so it gives them the capability, if they want to go into that field, to safely learn as a desktop role, understand the RMA, the powers of their warrants and assessment of data, and from there they can move on into field training for incident response or field inspections, which then in turn leads on to being a senior, in theory, a team leader and one-day manager, if that's how they choose to progress.
Thank you.
And if I could just, if I may, just make a couple of comments on the nitrogen stuff. I think sometimes these messages get lost in the confusion, and it's clear that the timeframes have changed. But what's been really important to sort of recognise is that Environment Southland developed a tool to register this information on time that anybody could use, and I think sometimes that gets lost in the confusion around the government portal. But I'd just like to acknowledge the team that have worked really hard to meet those existing deadlines and did so. Now, that's not to say that that system's perfect, far from it, but it is certainly available and people can use it, and was there on time and delivered quite seamlessly. So I just think it's worth acknowledging that. And it goes without saying, we'll continue to review the way we approach the reporting, and if there's an opportunity for a look at some of the fees and charges, noted that it's in our fees and charges policy, but we are allowed to look at it in a pragmatic way, and we will do so. But I just wanted to acknowledge the staff. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes to be in a position where they could actually receive data on time, and that probably sometimes goes, well, sometimes we're not aware of that and the work behind the scenes.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's good that staff will take a proactive stance towards this and make it easier for the people who have to report. I had a question. I did raise it with an email about site visits. There was the daily farming program on Hokanui Radio has a number of correspondents, and one of them raised a matter of farm visit he had from Environment South, and which was in the nature of a surprise. And 4 times during the program he said, I wish they would have told me a week ahead or a couple of days ahead that they were coming. So that's a matter we've discussed here before, and I know that there's various approaches across New Zealand. Some councils give lots of notice, even written notice, and others just turn up. So what's our current position with site visits?
So historically, we've always called from the farm gate to advise we're on site and we're about to complete an inspection. Towards the end of last season, I asked staff to make sure they call from the previous property to notify that we were on our way, estimate travel time to give them notice and ask if they would like to be present, and then we call again from the farm gate to let them know that we're here and we can meet them at the dairy shed or wherever they've asked us to meet them. We're going to continue that process this year. However, we are open to trialling other options throughout the season, and I've been in contact with my CSIG group around which councils, how much notice they give, how they do that, to make sure that we're trying to work, within scope with the rest of the sector. Most of the feedback, it's been really evenly spread between absolutely no notice at all, towards the 30 minutes to an hour's notice, to pre-empting by 1 to 2 days. So the sector is fairly well spread across the 3 auctions. We're open to reviewing ours throughout the season as staff hit the field.
Thank you.
It's important to note that this is for a scheduled discharge permit inspection. However, incidents, there is not always the opportunity to call ahead. Our response and our priority is to get there and make sure environmental risks are mitigated and actions taken. So often those calls are made from site.
Thank you, Donna.
It's a tricky. My instinct is that there's no. It's more of an art than a science, I suppose, in terms of how you do that. I think we take an ICM approach, customer-centric processes are at the heart of that. And so I think as an organisation, we will lean and continue to lean towards working with consent holders to give them time, but equally, because it's a consent inspection, we also want to not give too much time in terms of preparation. So it is a difficult line to walk, but certainly welcome feedback, and we'll always review our processes. So I think, Donna, one of the things that we could do is to tell our story within the CSIG to see if there's any consistency that we can promote around the country, because I think we'll get criticised anyway, but certainly I think we're trying to be more thoughtful and people are busy as well, so we're trying to and I know that some of the complaints revolve around health and safety concerns, and the way in which the team are authorised or warranted to some degree to go onto the property overrides the health and safety. So we take the health and safety onus on ourselves to go onto the properties. So that's not always a reason not to go on the property, but we wouldn't just wander on without that health and safety sort of approach already in mind. But it's certainly something that we continue to review, Cam.
Chairman Hall.
Just on that, I'm just thinking, I've often thought the ways we can reward good performers. If we had a bit of a risk-based matrix, so people are consistently good. I know a lot of them complain. I was away that day and I really would have liked to have been there because we're actually quite proud of what they're doing. That may be a way forward, that if you've got compliance, I'm sure you'll probably stick to we're at the farm gate, but you might go 24 hours, 48 hours for people with a good record. And I think we're always looking at how do we reward people that are genuinely doing the right thing, and that just may be a way of doing it. But it's management issue. I'll just throw that out there.
Councillor McLeod.
Can I just make a comment on that? We have started with our Dairy Top Performer program, so adding another layer to that program, rewarding the good behaviour, is a good option for us and something I'm happy to look at this season.
And just to reiterate on that, is that when we look at the regional forum recommendations about how do we reward good behaviour and all that, and I take it that's our discretion about when we inform. It's not a government thing. We actually have some control over that for a change, and and that it would make sense if you know there's good people out there. Well, courtesy, hey, look, but you do know ones that would have a problem. It could be, and I would certainly support what Chairman Hall. I think it would be a really good incentive for these to get there.
And if we were in that situation, the benefit from us for having a longer arrangement time. I imagine from a personnel management perspective, if we were making appointments and giving good performers a longer lead-in time before there would be secondary benefits for the way that we manage our work, but we also have to be from a compliance perspective cognizant that we make a decision, we do that in a really considered way, because I think at the moment the courtesy of, it seems like you're saying 30 minutes before the next visit is a nice courtesy, but we can certainly review it. We can continue to review it, and I think that have we got a list of top performers that you've in terms of the dairy stuff? What are the numbers on that, Donna?
Through you, Mr. Chair, last year we had 70 offers go out to participate. It's a voluntary program, so not all consent holders choose to pick it up if they're absentee owners. They like the security of someone else coming on site. However, some do like it and take it as a training opportunity. So if we come out to do a quality assurance check, find the consent holder and all the staff, and we all walk through the paddocks together and we talk about systems and improvements.
What's the big difference between a routine compliance inspection and an incident, I'm sure. Councillor Baird.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So it is reasonably obvious my point here, but I mean the dairy industry, when it's milking is a 7-day-a-week business, and obviously there's an expectation that people have some days off, and quite often the person in charge may roster himself off during the week, and allowing staff to have weekends off and so forth. So they may not be available to take that call. They might be on their RDO. So not a complete problem, but I think if you are looking to talk to that person who is in charge of the operation, then it may not be, it may be more beneficial if there was an opportunity to talk some time ahead, either a day ahead or 2 days ahead, to see whether that person will be available on that day if you are coming. So a minor point in some respects, but that's if we are looking to talk to the ones who are running the farm and explain, rather than having to then subordinate down to who's in charge, whether it be a 2IC, herd manager, or whoever else might be available to take the visit when you turn up. If you weren't able to meet the farm manager or the person in charge of the operation, would you decline to attend, or you would attend anyway?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So we do have a number of consent holders who have pre-identified that certain staff must be present during an inspection, just because sometimes it's absentee owners or it's their preference. So when we call, if they're unavailable, we would arrange to come back another time if that's suitable for them. Just as when we do contact and they say it's a particularly bad day, we're human beings and things happen in our personal lives. If we're told today's just not a good day and the circumstances are explained, we arrange to come back another day. There's no issue. We wouldn't, unless it's an incident, we wouldn't just go and complete the inspection. We give them the privacy and the dignity that they need.
Thank you. I think that some valid points have been raised, and there's obviously some areas where discretion can be exercised. Thank you. Are there any further questions or commentary on the Compliance Division report? If not, so we'd like to move that we receive that. Thank you, Molly. Seconded by? Councillor Stevens, it's your turn. Unless there's any further discussion, we'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone against? It is carried. Thank you, team, for your full reports and responses to our questions today. Going back to the agenda, extraordinary and urgent business, there is none. Public excluded business, there is none of that either. So I declare that the meeting is concluded. Thank you for your attendance